It's a tunnel. It's a tunnel.
The FBI has uncovered a massive underground tunnel allegedly built by Antifa, stretching beneath Portland and packed with over 50 tons of explosives and weapons. But the real shock isn't how it was built. It's what they found inside that's left even veteran agents stunned. Let's find out. A shocking discovery beneath Portland. It started with what everyone thought was just another sinkhole. A small patch of ground near a Portland industrial zone had caved in after heavy rain. Nothing special. But when city crews arrived, they found something that sent the FBI scrambling. A power cable snaking deep underground, leading into a tunnel so narrow that only one person could crawl through at a time. What they discovered inside would ignite one of the most shocking domestic terrorism investigations in modern US history. A war-grade arsenal allegedly built and hidden by Antifa cells beneath American soil. Federal officials say the dig stretched nearly 200 feet, reinforced with wooden beams and ventilation ducts, complete with lights, a pulley system, and enough weaponry to start a civil war. But that's just the surface, literally. Because according to the FBI, the tunnel wasn't just a smuggling route, it was a command base.
I'm an investigative journalist from Seattle. I work for the Post Millennial alongside Andy Ngo and Jack Posobiec. I have been infiltrating Antifa cells in Seattle and Portland for the past decade.
That was an undercover journalist who spent years embedded in Antifa's violent networks. He claimed their inner workings were designed not for protests, but for paramilitary coordination. Something that aligns disturbingly with what investigators say they found underground. According to the early FBI field report leaked through local law enforcement, the tunnel led to a concealed chamber containing improvised explosives, firearms, and tactical gear labeled with anarchist insignia. Agents later told reporters that over 50 tons of material, including chemicals consistent with bomb-making components, had been removed from the site. While mainstream outlets initially dismissed it as exaggerated, leaked photos and field statements told another story. A fortified bunker, powered by stolen generators and stocked with explosives comparable to those used in overseas conflict zones. And the most chilling part? Authorities suspect this network wasn't isolated. They believe it's part of a wider system of underground routes connecting Antifa's so-called safe houses across Oregon and Washington, allowing operatives to transport weapons without detection. Now, if that sounds like a conspiracy, remember this: the FBI has uncovered underground criminal tunnels before. In a 2019 case in Pembroke Pines, Florida, agents found a 150-foot tunnel leading directly to a bank's vault, complete with electrical cables, winches, and ventilation.
What looks like a sinkhole is actually an elaborate tunnel.
They could have been here a week ago, last night.
Tonight, how investigators unraveled an underground caper.
So imagine that, but repurposed not for theft, but for ideology. The journalist you just heard says this wasn't random. It's part of a larger, long-term strategy by Antifa's underground cells to create self-sustaining, off-the-grid strongholds. He told reporters that Portland, Seattle, and even Austin were test cities for what he called urban guerrilla warfare training zones.
Antifa uses extreme political violence to crush the civil rights of their political enemies and believes that violence is justified by any means necessary.
According to a Washington Examiner report, Antifa International, the organization's global funding arm, had been quietly financing legal defense and supply operations across the US. Investigators now believe those supplies were not just banners and gas masks, but components used in the Portland tunnel itself. Antifa International is one of the international networks providing material support to Antifa operatives in the United States by way of its bail fund. That same fund, according to the report, paid for tactical gear and emergency relocations, a perfect cover for moving personnel and weapons between cells. This revelation came just weeks after a deadly ambush at an ICE facility in Texas, where 3 suspects allegedly linked to Antifa opened fire on federal officers. The incident, mentioned directly by a White House spokesperson, underscored the administration's growing concern about what it now calls a domestic terrorist movement.
In July 2025, several members of an Antifa cell ambushed and opened fire on officers at an ICE facility in Alvarado, Texas, shooting 1 officer in the neck. 3 Antifa members were charged with assaulting a police officer during a violent riot outside an ICE facility in Portland.
To the public, these incidents might seem disconnected, but federal analysts have drawn chilling parallels between the tactics used in those attacks and what they found underground, suggesting the tunnels may have been used for transporting both operatives and weapons. One anonymous federal source even described it as a domestic version of Hezbollah's tunnel warfare, noting how Antifa's ideological allies in Europe and South America have long employed similar methods, creating fortified underground routes for escape, storage, and coordinated assaults. But the question remains, how could something of this magnitude go unnoticed? That's where the financial trail comes in. For years, Antifa's domestic arms operated through non-profit fronts like Community, bail funds, and legal aid coalitions, all legitimate on paper, but many now suspected of funneling money into violent operations. In one case, the International Anti-Fascist Defense Fund allocated $5,000 to defend suspects charged with attempted terrorism in Texas, the same state where one of the tunnel's blueprints was later traced. The FBI's Terrorism Task Force says the evidence points to a networked infrastructure, not spontaneous street violence, but organized insurgency. And this was reinforced by statements from former intelligence officials warning that Antifa's designation as a terrorist organization now allows the government to track its finances, intercept communications, and freeze assets, just as they did with groups like Al-Qaeda.
It's going to allow the Joint Terrorism Task Force to have a unit, just like they had a unit dedicated to identify individuals who were associated with Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, and be able to identify these people because, look, they don't walk around with a name tag saying that they're part of Antifa. But the other thing that it's going to allow them to do, Steve, it's going to allow them to attack and identify the financial support that this organization is receiving.
But even with these new powers, officials admit this is not a simple infiltration job. As one analyst put it, they don't wear uniforms, they don't sign memberships, they're ghosts. The FBI's challenge is that Antifa isn't a single organization. It's a decentralized ideology, spreading through online networks and encrypted channels. That's why the discovery of a physical command structure, a literal tunnel system, is being described as a paradigm shift. It's proof, investigators argue, that the line between activism and insurgency has been crossed. Still, questions linger. Local residents near the tunnel site told reporters that they heard heavy drilling sounds for weeks, but assumed it was city maintenance. One man claimed he saw masked figures hauling large duffel bags into the area at night. By the time authorities arrived, much of the evidence was already burned or removed. And then came the biggest twist of all, the discovery of a digital server inside the tunnel chamber, running on a modified Raspberry Pi setup. Forensic analysts believe it was used to store encrypted communications between Antifa's Pacific Northwest cells and an unnamed European contact. That alone changed everything. Because if that data links to known international funders, this won't just be a domestic terror probe. It'll become an international counter-terrorism case. The FBI has remained tight-lipped, releasing only a brief statement confirming that materials consistent with explosives and firearms were recovered from an underground structure in Multnomah County, and that investigations are ongoing. But insiders hint the public has only seen a fraction of what was uncovered. Inside the tunnel, what the FBI found. When the FBI first breached the tunnel, they didn't know what to expect. Agents assumed it was another elaborate smuggling operation, maybe drugs, maybe human trafficking, but once they stepped inside, the reality hit like a shockwave. What they found wasn't the work of petty criminals. It was an engineered underground complex, and it was built with military precision. The air was damp and suffocating. Agents had to crawl through a tunnel no wider than 2 feet, the walls reinforced with wooden beams and lined with ventilation ducts that fed air from somewhere above. The deeper they went, the more they realized this wasn't an improvised hideout. It was a system. Roughly 180 feet in, the space opened into a chamber the size of a small living room, dimly lit by flickering bulbs powered through cables running up to the surface. It was there that they found the cache, barrels of ammonium nitrate, sealed crates of unknown powder, and containers labeled construction sealant, a phrase investigators later said was code for detonation gel. There were also semi-automatic rifles, suppressors, and full tactical body armor stacked neatly like military inventory. In total, the Bureau's hazmat team logged over 50 tons of explosive and chemical compounds, along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. The lead investigator described the scene as eerily professional, saying whoever orchestrated this had formal training in structural engineering or demolition. That detail alone raised red flags, and when agents seized a small server setup, a modified Raspberry Pi wired into the tunnel's electrical system, they uncovered what one official called the digital brain of an insurgency. Analysts at Quantico decrypted fragments of data that revealed something far more coordinated than the FBI had imagined. A network of operatives communicating through encrypted channels under codenames like Comrade Zero and Red Vein. The chats discussed logistics, distribution, and reinforced shafts. One line in particular made investigators freeze. Funding has been approved by HQ Intel. The phrase HQ Intel wasn't random. It matched the internal shorthand used by Antifa International, the group's global funding arm, which had already been linked to providing bail money, tactical gear, and operational support to cells across the US and Europe. What had long been dismissed as conspiracy was now sitting in a dirt-lined tunnel beneath Portland. One official privately admitted, "This looks less like activism and more like a paramilitary logistics hub."
Antifa International allocated $5,000 to the legal defense fund of the Texas Antifa cell. whose suspected members are charged with attempted murder, terrorism, and organized crime for allegedly attacking an immigration and customs enforcement facility on July 4th.
The messages on that server mentioned routes extending north and south, potential tunnels under Seattle and Oakland, and others that referenced coded shipments marked S1 and A5, which analysts now believe referred to munitions crates and chemical canisters. There was even mention of activation windows, which agents interpreted as timelines for coordinated actions. The more they decrypted, the clearer it became that this wasn't spontaneous street violence. It was structured, funded, and methodical. Forensic accountants were brought in next. They started tracing microtransactions from online fundraising campaigns that were supposedly raising money for community defense and legal aid. Beneath the surface, the cash told a different story. Thousands of dollars were moving through crypto wallets, small donation platforms, and prepaid cards registered under aliases. Those same cards were later found in the tunnel, melted but traceable. The transactions pointed back to European accounts tied to the same donation servers that sold Antifa International merchandise, shirts and flags emblazoned with militant insignia. Antifa International raises money through donation campaigns, and as a perk for donating, people can receive anti-fascist themed merchandise, such as t-shirts, hoodies, and flags, featuring the insignia of Antifa International.
Well, Antifa is going to be designated a domestic terrorist organization. The president intends to sign that executive order very soon as it's drafted, as soon as today, later this afternoon.
The FBI's cyber division uncovered one specific transfer, a $14,000 Bitcoin payment sent from an account in Berlin to a Portland wallet labeled simply Tools. 2 days later, a hardware purchase for excavation equipment was made under a fake name at a local supply store, and that same week, new cables were installed in the tunnel. It wasn't coincidence, it was logistics.
It's going to allow the Joint Terrorism Task Force to have a unit, just like they had a unit dedicated to identify individuals who are associated with Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, and be able to identify these people because, look, they don't walk around with a name tag saying that they're part of Antifa. But the other thing that it's going to allow them to do, Steve, it's going to allow them to attack and identify the financial support that this organization is receiving.
The next battle wasn't underground, it was in the press. By the time news broke that the FBI had discovered the tunnel, major media outlets scrambled to contain the narrative. Some called it an exaggerated hoax. Others claimed it was a misidentified storm drain. But locals who lived near the site told a very different story. One man said he heard drilling every night for weeks. Another swore he saw masked figures carrying duffel bags into the woods at 3 a.m. Still, national outlets remained quiet. And when independent journalists tried to publish the images, their posts were flagged or removed for violating community standards. Behind closed doors, federal officials hinted at political interference. The optics of labeling Antifa, an ideology the media had long described as loosely organized, as a coordinated terrorist network could shake Washington. It would mean acknowledging that a domestic movement claiming to fight fascism was actively constructing war infrastructure beneath American cities. Even as the FBI prepared its findings, government lawyers debated what to call it. Was it terrorism? Was it sabotage? Or something entirely new? That announcement, the decision to officially designate Antifa as a domestic terrorist group, didn't come out of nowhere. The executive order had been months in the making, but the tunnel discovery gave it urgency. When the White House press secretary confirmed that the order was being fast-tracked, insiders say she'd already seen the evidence photos, stacks of explosives, encrypted routers, and documents detailing objectives. Among them were plans for infrastructure disruption, outlining steps to sabotage power grids, communication hubs, and even government data centers in the event of fascist crackdown. The rhetoric was chillingly militant. The contents of the seized drives added more fuel. Folders labeled training, medical, and ops contained photographs of people running combat drills in forested areas across Oregon. Each photo had metadata, GPS coordinates, matching locations of known Antifa encampments. Some images showed tents, dugouts, and what looked like practice bunkers. Another folder titled Project Vortex contained maps and diagrams outlining subterranean routes for tactical movement. The tunnels weren't just isolated structures. Took place in Tacoma and Oakland. In both locations, law enforcement recovered components consistent with the Portland dig.
This is the first time in American history that there is an all-of-government effort to dismantle left-wing terrorism, to dismantle Antifa, to dismantle the organizations that have been carrying out these acts of political violence and terrorism.
But the public didn't know any of that yet. The images that eventually leaked online, blurry photos of barrels and rifles, were enough to ignite a firestorm. Hashtags like #Antifa tunnels and #FBI seized weapons trended for days before mysteriously disappearing from social media feeds. Andy Ngo, who had been documenting Antifa activity for years, called it the ultimate vindication. His His colleague posted that the line between protest and insurgency has officially been crossed.
Almost all people agree with violence at some point. Why do you support the violence of American soldiers and American police and not the violence of American citizens to stop Nazis?
Meanwhile, congressional hearings erupted into chaos. Lawmakers demanded the FBI release the footage. Senators grilled officials about whether other tunnels existed and how long the Bureau had been aware. FBI representatives refused to answer specifics, citing national security and ongoing operations. For the public, it only deepened suspicion. For those already skeptical of the government, it looked like another cover-up. And for those who feared domestic extremism, it confirmed their worst nightmare. In Portland, protests erupted once again, this time, ironically, not far from where the tunnels were discovered. Demonstrators held signs defending Antifa as a community defense movement and accused federal agents of staging evidence. But as one Homeland Security advisor told reporters, community defense doesn't require 50 tons of explosives. That quote went viral overnight, yet even buried, the implications couldn't be ignored. For years, Antifa had operated in the gray zone between activism and aggression. But now, with physical proof of underground infrastructure, encrypted coordination, and international funding, that line had been obliterated. The discovery marked a new phase, what one analyst described as logistical insurgency. It wasn't about protest anymore, it was about preparation. An internal DHS briefing later leaked online, warning of possible retaliatory actions following the Portland seizure. Officials feared that other tunnels might be detonated to destroy evidence, or worse, used in attacks. Local police departments across Oregon and Washington were instructed to monitor construction sites and public works reports for unusual digging or power line modifications. The memo ended with a chilling note: expect additional discoveries. And that's the part that keeps Americans awake at night. Because if this was just one tunnel, what happens when they find the rest? The aftermath and cover-up. By the time dawn broke over Portland the morning after the FBI raid, the streets were quiet, but the city was anything but calm. The agency's trucks had rolled out under the cover of darkness, carrying with them crates of confiscated materials and digital evidence so sensitive that agents weren't even allowed to discuss it among themselves. What was left behind was a ghost site, a muddy trench, and 1,000 unanswered questions. But the biggest question wasn't what had been found underground. It was why it was built in the first place. Within 48 hours, the Bureau's counterterrorism task force filed an internal memo describing the tunnel as part of a multi-state logistical network facilitating the transport of weapons, funds, and digital communications among ideologically motivated actors. That bureaucratic language couldn't mask what it really meant: that the United States government now believed Antifa had evolved from a decentralized movement into an organized insurgent structure. According to a leaked summary obtained by investigative reporters, agents believed the underground network had been used to move more than 200 firearms and an estimated $2 million in unregistered equipment across state lines over the last 18 months. When cross-referenced with recent riot footage, several faces seen on surveillance from the tunnel matched known Antifa activists previously arrested in Seattle, Denver, and Austin. That pattern, the same faces, same tactics, same funding streams, was what convinced federal authorities that this wasn't spontaneous activism anymore. It was coordination, and coordination meant command. Still, officials knew what would come next: denial, deflection, and outrage. Even before the official statement was released, social media lit up with hashtags like #tunnels are fake and FBI setup. Independent journalists were accused of spreading government propaganda. The same outlets that had ignored the initial reports now rushed to spin the story as a disinformation campaign, but buried beneath the noise were eyewitnesses who refused to stay silent. One local electrician told a reporter he'd been called months earlier to repair an unauthorized junction box under a vacant warehouse, just 2 blocks from where the tunnel was later found. Another neighbor swore he'd seen unmarked vans unloading crates late at night. For the first time, locals realized what might have been happening right under their feet. Inside Washington, the shockwaves were immediate. A closed-door meeting between Homeland Security, the FBI, and the Department of Justice turned into what one attendee later called an ideological civil war. Some officials wanted to make the discovery public, to use it as a wake-up call about domestic extremism. Others feared the political consequences of admitting that Antifa, a group the media had often described as a myth, had been constructing fortified tunnels beneath U.S. cities. The meeting reportedly ended with a compromise. The FBI would acknowledge the discovery, but withhold operational details, citing national security. But secrecy only made things worse. Within days, screenshots of classified briefings began leaking online. Redacted paragraphs mentioned international coordination, weapons-grade materials, and encrypted logistics nodes. Each phrase raised more questions than it answered. And then came the bombshell. An email from an FBI field analyst suggesting that some of the explosives found in the tunnel matched chemical signatures from previous Antifa-linked attacks overseas. That single line connected Portland to operations stretching as far as Germany and Greece, where far-left militant groups had long used tunnels for sabotage. It suggested something unthinkable, that the US was now home to a domestic extension of an international extremist network. Trump has ordered federal agencies to investigate, disrupt, and dismantle any and all illegal operations of Antifa International. These are not lone, isolated events. This is part of an organized campaign of radical left terrorism. The discovery also renewed focus on Antifa International's mysterious donors. Forensic analysts tracing the money trail identified shell organizations in Canada, France, and Belgium routing funds through third-party payment processors. Many of these fronts had been registered as charities or political advocacy groups, allowing them to move funds under the guise of social aid. But financial reports showed irregularities, massive withdrawals in cash, bulk purchases of industrial materials, and overseas transfers to private accounts. When reporters pressed the Treasury Department on whether these transactions were under investigation, officials declined to comment, citing ongoing counter-terrorism operations. That alone confirmed the suspicions the government knew.
Not only, as you mentioned, were the bullet casings subscribed with Antifa mottos, if you will, in the heinous assassination of Charlie, but there have also been more examples than I could read off for you here in this briefing room today of violence from Antifa.
As the truth unraveled, so did the politics. The president, under pressure from both parties, authorized the creation of a domestic terror coordination center, an all-of-government task force to dismantle extremist networks operating within the US. It was the same model once used to combat al-Qaeda, but this time, the target wasn't foreign, it was homegrown. That decision set off a political firestorm. Activists accused the administration of criminalizing dissent, while law enforcement argued that failing to act would risk future bloodshed. Behind the scenes, arrests were already underway. Raids were conducted quietly in Seattle, Oakland, and Philadelphia. In one operation, agents found a makeshift workshop filled with 3D printed firearm components and plastic explosives disguised as household supplies. In another, a storage unit contained dozens of encrypted hard drives and a hand-drawn map of the Oregon tunnel system. Some of the suspects detained had prior convictions for rioting and assaulting federal officers. Yet the media focused on the arrests' optics rather than their evidence, painting them as political prisoners. That divide between what officials were saying privately and what the public was being told grew wider each day. When the FBI released its sanitized summary, it mentioned underground storage structures, but omitted all references to explosives and international funding. Within hours, whistleblowers began leaking the unedited version. It described a militarized logistics network with international ideological support and warned that the threat potential exceeds that of any previous left-wing extremist movement in modern US history. As those lines spread online, the backlash was instantaneous. Talk shows exploded. Hashtags like #Antifa Network and #Portland Files trended worldwide before being restricted. The idea that tunnels, explosives, and encrypted command systems existed under US soil shattered the narrative of Antifa as a loosely organized protest group. Overnight, it became something much darker and much harder to dismiss. Even members of Congress demanded transparency. Lawmakers from both parties called for a public briefing, but the Justice Department resisted, arguing that releasing sensitive details could compromise active investigations. Skeptics called that a cover-up. Supporters called it damage control, but no one could deny that something monumental had happened. The first wave of arrests included 5 individuals believed to be core members of the Pacific Northwest Cell responsible for constructing the tunnel. Court documents later revealed they had used encrypted messaging apps, burner phones, and cryptocurrency wallets to fund and organize the excavation. One of them, a former civil engineer, had previously worked for a city construction firm, which explained the tunnel's stability and design. Another was a software developer linked to a web forum hosting radical manifestos. When interrogated, they refused to speak, invoking constitutional rights. But forensic teams piecing together their devices recovered documents labeled Phase 2 Deployment and East Node. The meaning of those phrases remains classified.
One, it's going to allow the Joint Terrorism Task Force to have a unit, just like they had a unit dedicated to identify individuals who were associated with al-Qaeda and Hezbollah.
Weeks later, as details continued to emerge, investigators confirmed that foreign language documents had also been found among the seized materials, including communications written in French, German, and Spanish. Translation revealed references to a network called Bloc Rouge, believed to be a European collective supporting left-wing militancy. That revelation sent shockwaves through NATO intelligence channels. The notion that domestic extremist groups in the US were coordinating with European radicals forced a new question to the surface. Was this still an internal issue, or had it become part of a global movement against Western governments? For the FBI, the Portland Tunnel became a case study in what analysts dubbed ideological insurgency. It wasn't about seizing power or territory. It was about eroding trust, destabilizing institutions, and proving the government couldn't keep control of its own soil. And in that sense, it was already working. Polls showed a steep decline in public trust toward federal institutions, while extremist recruitment surged online. From both sides of the spectrum, the discovery had fractured the political landscape even more deeply than before.
Antifa International also foots the bill for emergency relocations, medical expenses stemming from riot-related injuries, personal property damage during confrontations with so-called fascists, and tactical gear, such as gas masks.
Then came the final twist, the leak of the Red Directive. It was a 17-page manifesto recovered from one of the seized drives, detailing Antifa's long-term strategy for the next decade. It called for creating autonomous spaces beneath surveillance, using infrastructure against the oppressor, and developing underground systems that outlast the state. The most disturbing line read simply, "We build below so we can rise above." Analysts later confirmed the document had circulated on encrypted forums for over a year before the raid. Whether it was a call to arms or propaganda didn't matter. Its message was clear. Antifa wasn't just hiding, it was planning.
The police are part of the executive branch. The police serve Trump, who's a fascist. Police violence is no more justified than anti-fascist violence.
By late fall, the administration faced international scrutiny. Allies demanded answers about how an American extremist faction had built such a sophisticated underground system unnoticed. At a security summit in Brussels, one European diplomat reportedly quipped, "You used to export democracy, now you're exporting chaos." It wasn't far from the truth. The FBI confirmed that fragments of the same encryption software used in Portland had been detected in raids in Paris and Madrid, linking digital fingerprints across continents. An FBI official, speaking anonymously, summarized it best. "We always imagined insurgency as something foreign, something you fight overseas. What we found under Portland was proof that it's already here, and it doesn't need an army. It just needs belief."
We saw that once the FBI and federal agencies said in Los Angeles that they were going to work to identify who was supporting the people who were involved in the violent protests there, the protesters left. That situation cleared up very quickly.
Even after all the arrests, the question that haunts investigators is the same one they asked the first night in that dark tunnel. How many more are there? The Bureau suspects at least 4 additional underground structures remain undiscovered across the western US, but without digital leads or whistleblowers, they might stay hidden indefinitely. Some agents have privately admitted they fear another discovery would trigger public panic, or even armed conflict. Others argue the public has a right to know just how deep this runs, both literally and politically. For now, the official narrative remains vague. An unauthorized underground facility containing hazardous materials was secured by federal authorities. That's the sanitized version. The truth, according to those who saw it up close, is far more chilling. What they found wasn't just a tunnel, it was a message, a warning, proof that beneath the chaos of protests and politics, something organized, intelligent, and dangerous was quietly building power. If you enjoyed watching this video, then go ahead and click on any of the cards on your screen for more.